Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long-term business survival and success is a result of maximizing profits, which can only happen after you've optimized your people. And people really get optimized when you put them in a low friction revenue context. And so that's what this podcast is dedicated to. We do it twice a month. We bring you people out there in the real world who are working on exactly the same things of how do they maximize profit and how do they optimize their people. And sometimes they're having massive successes and we get to learn from that. And sometimes, like the rest of us, they're struggling and trying to figure out what's next. But in every case, they're making us all smarter so we can all hopefully step up our game a level or two. Today, we've got Luke Voivoda. I met Luke a few weeks ago, and I got fascinated by his LinkedIn because it starts right out with he's a professional friend maker. And I've probably seen 10,000, 100,000 LinkedIn profiles. That's the first time I'd ever seen a professional friend maker. And we had a chance to have a one-to-one, and I got to learn more about what he does. And it's fascinating, it's fun, and he's a connector. He builds bridges, fills gaps, aligns mutual interests, and facilitates opportunities that maybe wouldn't have existed if he wasn't in the picture. And so bringing that value to the table is what he really does. And I thought we need to hear about that. And one of the things I'm going to ask him to also talk about is his undergraduate degree had a selling component to it, which today is still fairly rare. So hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit about how that helped him launch in his career. So Luke, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Rick, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, please start with bringing us up to date on where you are, but how you got here, and what was it that drove you to be a professional friend maker?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm excited to chat with you today to hopefully, as you said, share some knowledge with the viewers. I think this can be a great conversation. To really jump into what you're talking about, where I am right now, and then, maybe I can go backwards from there, is I own my own firm called Ace Business Development with two counterparts of mine. Our firm, Ace Business Development, what we do is fractional sales. Fractional BD. And a lot of people go fractional, what is that? And so really what it is we come in to try to bring value, to try to turn a process on its head, to try to figure out something that might not be working for a group that already has, some semblance of a sales team, some semblance of a business development process that they're using today. But again, we come into it, augment it, bolster it, make it better. This, wasn't obviously what I had initially set out to do, but it's a very interesting place that I found myself. I very much enjoy it, and we're making some good traction for my customers. But the place that I really came from was the federal marketplace. And so to dive a little bit more into, like where I've really come from is I had always known I wanted to be in professional selling, professional sales. And even with my friends, I'd gotten the jokes about, oh, you're going to be a used car salesman. You'll slap the hood of the car and try to sell me something. But I had always found that sales was more than that, truly. And I had always thought that it was more, and I thought it was fascinating that people never thought it was more than that. And so I ended up going to Virginia Tech, Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State, over down here in Virginia. That's where I'm currently at now. And when I entered the school, I had known, I had wanted to go into business. That sales was likely something that I was passionate about, but I had not known that they had a professional selling program. So happy to talk a little bit more about that. But I was able to plug into that to Mr. Brian Collins was my professor and the head of the department. He's still there now, and I honestly can't tell you how great he is and just how knowledgeable he is, how much he's able to give back to the students. But I left the school with a professional sales degree, marketing professional sales concentration to be specific, and I joined joined a firm that was sales development representatives. And I'd actually done an internship there. And when I was an intern, I was fortunate enough to be one of the top performers. And so when I got brought back, I was going to be going full time in a very similar role as I was a top performer in. Well, when I got there, I was told I was going to report to the GovCon division instead of the like kind of the medical sales division, I believe it was that I was initially going to go into. And I was like, GovCon, government, this was not the public sector team. This doesn't make sense. So I went to my manager and I was talking to him, and he's like, yeah, like this is a hard place. It's a hard division, and we need some top performers to move there. So we had to move you over. So I kind of got thrown into the deep end right off the bat and was told to start cold calling the government. I found out that that is a difficult thing to do. And I learned that again with some trial by fire. But that was really what started to get me interested in this space is I started realizing even from an SDR cold calling capacity that you could not cold call the government the same way that you were cold calling industry counterparts. And so that's what really, again, just got me interested in this space and got the ball rolling. And from there, I was an account executive. I was a senior account executive. I was the director of business development at a woman-owned small business, all the while working within the federal marketplace and starting to figure out, how is this arena and the business development and sales process different from industry? And so I've been working on it. I definitely wouldn't say I haven't mastered yet, but I like to think I have a pretty good understanding of, again, what you need to do to really build opportunities, develop rapport, and gain relationships in the federal space, which again is why I like to say that at Ace Business Development, one of my main roles is to be a professional friend maker.
If I were to have imagined in the world of sales what my niche would be to be a professional friend maker, government wouldn't have been the one I would have picked.
It's a fair point. It's a fair point for sure.
So talk a little bit about, because you mentioned the challenges of cold calling and um, you know, I've had the opportunity to do a fair amount of government work and I always enjoyed it and found it to be very rewarding. But most people try to avoid it or they almost are defeatist before they get started.
Mhm.
What did you learn or apply or bring to the table that made this a pretty good place to be?
And that's a good question, Rick, because you're right. There is sometimes a connotation that's tied to the government contracting area as it being just a very difficult place to reside. And I honestly won't necessarily say I'm going to debunk that on this call today. Federal government contracting is definitely a difficult sport. You play it for keeps. That's for sure. And we've seen that a lot this year. This has been a very interesting year for the space.
Yeah.
But that said, it isn't that much different from the industry side of things. I mean, don't get me wrong, the procurement divisions in government are usually a bit more robust and have a bit more regulations that they need to follow than the procurement divisions of larger corporations. But that said, it is really all about deriving and figuring out how you can provide value to that group. And I think that that's just one of the biggest things that in government that is really forefront and must be forefront for different groups that are, again, regardless of if you're a business development person like myself, you're a CEO that's starting a government contracting firm. I mean, even project managers or IT folks that are on the ground, the government is an interesting place because their bottom line or profit, isn't necessarily their main motivator. It's mission
Right.
driven. So their KPIs are very different than when it comes to you trying to provide value and you trying to understand how to get embedded in an industry type group. And so because of that, there's a lot of rapport building that goes into play, and not even just rapport building, but honestly building trust, to put the real
Yeah,
words
yeah,
against it.
yeah,
You have to build trust with your clients, with your prospective clients, with your leads, because they're going to be able to give you a lot of intel. And when I mean intel, I don't mean that in any, again, kind of like
yeah.
crazy way or anything. Just there's a lot to understand in the government space. So the more that you can build trust and build relationships, the more that you can be, honestly, for lack of a better word, vulnerable with them to say, hey, I don't really understand what this means or how I can plug into it, but I'd like to know, could you help me? And then once you start to understand, you have a better idea of how you can bring and plug, how you can bring your offerings, your goods to the table, plug into the environment. And again, at the end all be all, provide value. So.
Yeah, very, very good. And one of the things you mentioned in the very beginning was, they have a different purpose or intent. They're not looking at ROI as not their metric. And one of the things we've learned over the last 30 years is purpose matters.
Yes.
Your purpose as the seller, their purpose as the buyer. really matters greatly and either contributes or detracts from value being transferred. Could you talk a little bit about the purpose of your organization and then how that lines up in your case with the government
Yeah.
departments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just starting off right off the bat, the purpose of my organization is to be a beacon for other groups that are confused. Honestly, if we just take all of the other words that could be thrown into it out of it, is it's to provide clarity and knowledge in a marketplace where that's not always abundantly available. And so specifically, so Ace Business Development, we support sales and business development processes for both industry and the government side of things. But I myself, besides being a partner in the firm, I'm the head of the government contracting practice. So a lot of my answers today are going to be a little bit more in the realm of
Yeah,
government, just
that's
because
good.
that's my bread and butter. That's where I live. But, the purpose that I see and the way that I've been able to see value brought to my clients and to the groups that I'm currently supporting today is through just allowing them to understand the sales cycle better, right? Every sales cycle is going to be different, whether, it's the personas that you're moving through the sales cycle, whether it's the industry or the vertical that, you're running within the sales funnel. There's a lot of different things. And again, the government one is really no different than that. It's a long sales cycle, first off. So you have to learn how to have patience. It's a convoluted one because there's a lot of stakeholders that are involved in every deal. Your decision maker, your champion, the person with the purse strings, all of them are separate. And in fact, they're not just separate, they're in separate departments. So you got to figure out how
Yeah,
to go
yeah.
about understanding and building relationships with all of them. And so the way that I really like to bring my purpose to the table is I am here to be a guide, to be a Sherpa, and I am never going to understand someone's thingamajig or who's he what's it or service as best as they do. They're the SME in that. But
Right.
I like to think that I have a good amount of federal marketplace knowledge that I can bring to the table and we can meet halfway. So they can tell me, how they normally plug into deals on the industry side of things. I can tell them how certain agencies typically buy or where they're buying or what they're buying. And then we meet in the middle to understand, okay, based on where you exist today and based on where I understand the landscape as it is today, here's some ways that we can plug into it to try to find opportunities.
I'm now going to leave the reservation, and I have to ask you a question that I get asked all the time. A number of years ago, I was asked to come down to speak at a group in Washington, and the lady who asked me to speak, she says, "Now," she said, "you know how government works." And I said, "Well, I've done a lot of work with government." And she said, "Okay, good, because some speakers don't understand." Well, I knew what she meant, and that was she was inferring that to get government work, everybody had to dive the price and minimize the value conversation.
Mhm.
And I was fortunate that I was the second speaker, and the first guy that spoke, he was introduced as the founder of American Intelligence, which
Okay.
I thought I wouldn't want that title personally, but and what he had done is he had built a company 20 years prior that created the software for the FBI and all of the security departments. Then he sold it to Lockheed, and now he was leaving Lockheed and gonna go do version two, this time with Lockheed as a major investor. And I asked him the question after he completed his talk, and he'd done tens upon tens of billions of dollars with the government. I asked him, how many times in all of those contracts did you discount your price? And his answer was zero. Yet there were 100 people in the room that believed the only way they could get government work was to get less than their full value back.
Mhm.
Tell me your observations and experience and what that has shown you.
I think that the one thing I'll really completely echo off of that is that, the way that deals are inked in the government is very interesting to someone who's even in the space, let alone someone who is a little bit more on the outskirts of the space. Proposals are not for the faint of heart, and there's a lot of things that come into play with them for sure. And so, I think that as far as really diving into the intricacies of how proposals are inked, I might leave that for a group that's a bit more well versed on it. But you're right. LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable, T&M, time and materials, labor hour, cost plus. There's a lot of different ways that deals are inked in the government just by a composition standpoint, and so you must understand how those are actually, again, going to impact your business, impact your cash flows, impact what you're putting forward. But at the same time, to kind of bring it a little bit, a little bit more macro, it doesn't necessarily matter which one of those is the preference of the procurement office or how that acquisition strategy is really going to ink. Because at the end of the day, regardless of how you set up your team, or regardless of how the deal is inked in that sense, you have to bring an outcome. And I think that we're hearing that more and more right now in the government space. Is we used to have these things, and we still do, but they're called SOWs. Hey, shocker, right? Government guy, government acronym.
Yep.
It's in the nature. But it's an SOW, a statement of work, and that's something that outlines what these proposals are. The government puts them forward and says, hey, this is all of the work we want inside of this project, inside of this this opportunity that's released. We want to understand how you're going to go about attacking all of this work. What's your plan? And we've been talking more and more about in industry how we see moving forward, we're going to be more on statement of objectives and not statement of work. And that's because we're going to put forward objectives that align to outcomes. And that's really what the new focus of government contracting is going to be, is that it's going to be outcome driven work. And again, you need to be compliant. That's one of rules number one in the government. You must be compliant. You must understand what your customer wants. But at the end of the day, things are really moving to outcome driven approaches. And so I agree with your initial analysis, which is that, it doesn't necessarily matter how the deal is inked, and you don't have to try to bring a price all the way down to the bottom. Because at the end of the day, if you can really understand what outcomes that group is looking for, specifically what outcomes align to their purpose, their mission,
Yeah.
then, it makes a lot more sense why someone would be working with you. And it goes back to, again, just that you're building that rapport, you're working with
Yeah.
them to understand, like what I'm bringing to the table is not just a nice to have. It's not just, something because it's fun. This is something that via all of our conversations, I have learned is going to allow you to have an easier day to day. It's going to allow your mission to execute cleaner. And so, while of course pricing is definitely something that's interesting in the government space, I think it's way more than just pricing. And it comes down to, how are you going to align yourself and the work that you're doing to the outcome that that group, that agency in this case really needs to happen.
Yeah, you right in the very beginning also dropped a gold nugget, I think, and that is recognizing the way individual agencies or individual procurements normally do work.
Yeah.
And, because, thinking back when we were in that space, that was one of the first things we figured out is how do they work? And then
Yep.
how can we align? So, and
Exactly.
that is equally important in government as it is in, traditional for-profit work. But I don't think we think about it that way in government.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think, I say this a lot to folks too. So something I'm happy to, dive into a little bit here is I think a lot of what I do, I get asked a lot right in the beginning of our engagements, right? Like, well, what is your work going to be like? What would an engagement like, working with Ace Business Development to bolster my business development needs look like? And, I always start by telling them the beginning is just research. I don't even really need to know all that much about them at that time. I need to understand what is happening at the target account. And I'm doing a lot of due diligence surrounding, again, what we just talked about. Like, what are they
Yeah.
buying? Who are they buying it from? How are they buying it? When are they buying it? Like,
Yeah.
it's really is, the five W's, and it's all around what you're, all around intelligence. And then from there, you start making assumptions. And that's when then getting in front of folks and building rapport and gaining relationships
Yeah.
makes the most sense, because now we're validating or disvalidating assumptions. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't understand how much time that takes,
Yeah.
and also why it's so important. Because again, if you are assuming, to just use our example and keep driving into it, right, that you have the best thingamajig and you want to sell your thingamajig to agency X, and you are spinning and spinning and trying to get in front of them and burning dollars to do as much as you can in business development, and then you finally get that one meeting, and then you learn from them that they don't buy thingamajigs, they buy who's what's its.
Yeah.
Then you just spent a lot of time where in the beginning that was an assumption that probably should have been looked into right off the bat. Because if we could have, we could have figured that out 1, 2 months prior, then we could have changed to agency Y and realized that they do actually buy that. And so now we're not just spinning our wheels and being busy for busy's sake, but we're being strategic about where our time and where, our cycles are being pointed at.
One of the things you're you're modeling is uh, for years we've tried to get selling organizations to answer the question, are you headquarters out or buyer back? And headquarters out, you've created your cool whatchamacallit, and you're just sure you're going to shove it down somebody's throat. Where
Mhm.
if you're buyer back, you do all those things you just talked about. You clarify, you validate, you solidify, you test that this really adds value to the buyer, and the buyer can monetize that value. And we don't even use monetize as money. It can be security, or it can be additional creativity, or innovation, or collaboration is part of what they are wanting to pay for and get.
Right.
And,
Hmm.
it sounds like your work is heavily going out to the buyer and becoming intimate with who they are, where they are, and how they move forward. Is that
I totally agree. Totally agree. And I think I'll piggyback on something you just said there, which is I like how you even just said you just qualified your definition of monetization, which is, I think, again, exactly what I'm doing in this space, which is to understand because, again, that these guys are not focused on, how cheap can I get production of a product or, how many different goods can I get sold or out on the marketplace? Like just again, like they're not a business. It's the federal government. So the KPIs and the things that keep them up at night and the things that it's mission critical to them are just different. And so again, to your point, depending on the agency, depending on the focus, depending on honestly the time of year or some uncontrollables that are coming from, just the marketplace and the environment in general, you need to be talking to these groups to understand exactly that. Like what is the KPI that to them they see monetization and they see like, well, this dollar figure associated against this work, this product, this thing is well worth it because we're going to be able to be more secure, quicker in the way that we respond to constituents, outline, better plans, better remediation plans for X, Y, and Z if something occurs. It can be very different. In fact, I've heard it all be very different. And, it's almost impossible for you to go in blind to say, like, I know what is going to help you because everyone's different. And again, even within, a single agency, you're talking to so many different departments that, what would help a procurement division is probably to get the contract off their desk as fast as possible, right? But what help a program team is for them to have something like maybe an AI that can more or less do their entire job. But that's probably not going to be what the IT department wants. They want a product that's compliant and within all the codes. And so you really do need to start understanding too, not just, the term of monetization for that agency, but again, with the stakeholders involved.
yeah? Um, our work would really echo yours, and we don't do much government at all anymore. But you are more, it's more necessary for you to have the disciplines to do those things up front. Partially, I'm guessing because of the length of the sales cycle and the complexity of it, not doing that work up front and not understanding those things is not a good formula.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one. And the thing is, and I think it goes to actually what you just said there, which is that these buying cycles are very long. There's some ways that you can reduce it, but again, you only really figure out those ways that you can reduce it by again building intimacy, gaining traction places, and then it's possible for it to be a little bit lighter. But honestly, I mean, the sales cycle in Fed is honestly typically at least a year, like 12
Yeah.
months. I mean, I worked on something one time that was about 19 months to get it across the finish line. It's long, it takes a while, and I think one of the interesting things too in the federal landscape, or I mean, like in public sector in general, I think you can throw state and local into this too. But it's just there is so much that is coming out, so many pieces of news and piece of information that are coming out about these opportunities. And the thing is, too, is it's not all up front, right? Like it's a linear progression of when some of this information gets released. And sometimes in the government space, too, you backtrack in a sense. You hear about something because it's on a procurement forecast, or you were at an event and they mentioned it, and you start thinking about it and you start putting it in the pipeline. But then by the time what the government government calls a request for information, an RFI comes out, for them to be talking about this more seriously, let's call it,
Yeah.
and them trying to understand from industry what's even feasible in this project, this initiative that they have. It could look very different. And so, honestly, from the time you even heard about it to responding to the RFI to give them information, you might decide that this no longer fits, or it still fits at the RFI stage. And then you start doing more and more due diligence and understanding what's happening, and you might find a requirement that knocks you guys out. Or again, the RFP drops and something new came up that was never discussed before, but maybe it came from that initial RFI that you hadn't known about. And so, one of the interesting things too is you're right. You can't afford to not do that up front, but you also can't afford to not continue to do it, because
Yeah.
if something appears and manifests when you didn't know about it, and back when it appeared 7 months ago, it looked good, but now we're looking at it today and we're just assuming it's still fine from 7 months ago, and you didn't read it well enough to
Oh
realize now
yeah.
that there's some problems. Like, it goes back to, it really is a big component of my job is that due diligence and that research, and not just doing it up front, but doing it throughout the entire opportunity, the entire deal life cycle.
I thank you for that, because I would say that is exactly the same thing in big enterprise work everywhere. That the variables change between for-profit and government, but the
Mhm.
process of doing that homework and understanding that buyer and understanding how they define value, and how you can communicate to them so that they know you heard them and understood, is universal, but just the nuances are different. I'm going to change directions on this now, because I think you've alerted me to an interesting place that ACE fits in the business world. And it's not unique, but I don't think many people think about it this way. And maybe I got it wrong, and you can correct me. But when I think about your work, some of your clients look at you and say, oh, ACE is a channel to the government. And the government looks at ACE and says, you're a knowledgeable thought leader provider who brings me cool stuff. Now, my guess is a lot of the potential clients, the original OEMs that you're going to represent, they really have no idea how to get to the government. And you actually have to do a consulting project with them to get them ready so that you could actually go to the government and present them in a way that the government would be glad they had the contract. Is that all true?
That is all true. In fact, it's very astute observation. I have to do that with my clients, is that it's just a different space. Your language of value. That's one of the things that I like to call it. Your language of value changes a lot when you cross over from that industry to that federal government side of things. In fact, it changes from agency to agency in the government when they're using
Oh,
different
yeah.
terms or things that you're doing. So again, it's very important. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's there are barriers to entry in the federal marketplace space, and so I try to do as much as I can with my clients to help them with those barriers of entry so that they can understand, the environment that we're plugging into. And it's not just me leading them blindly, so that I can help them get that strong foundation and get them set up with certain pieces of collateral. I have a lot of different partners that I work with on the regular to help, my clients understand, hey, if we need to do a new marketing campaign because it's going to be different from what you've done before, I know some people in the space that can help you with the federal marketing campaign effort. Same thing goes for collateral, capability statements. I think that is common still in the industry side of things, but in the government side of things, you share capability statements like you share business cards. And so, getting that spun up, because that's a common ask if you're trying to do partnership, if you're still trying to get in good with a government person, for them to even, vet if it's worth their time, right? Getting the cape statement is usually the first thing in the door. And if you're using language that's not their language of value and it doesn't resonate, or even worse, you're potentially looking at something that, based on just the environment today, that they were almost told no money is going there, then you can honestly end up disqualifying yourself faster than anything else. And so you're right, a
Yeah.
good chunk of the beginning of my engagement just goes to, like, let's dip your toes into this environment and let me explain to you, what it is you're going to be along for the ride for.
Well, and it sounds like you're bringing them other resources to kind of restructure messaging or processes, or I guess even pricing and delivery and supply chain thinking.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes into it. Again, there's a lot of things. There's barriers to entry just to enter the marketplace. There's a lot that goes in to be able to resonate within the marketplace. There's a lot of compliance that comes into effect to be able to stay in the marketplace. I mean, like, there's a lot of different things you have to think about. And so that's one of the things that I really do talk about with my clients, and honestly, to folks that aren't my clients too, kind of to the point, like the professional friend maker, that we talked about, is I know a lot of people. I talk a lot, as our viewers here are going to be able to tell. But I know a lot of people. I know a lot of firms, and maybe it does stem from the government side of things. But I'm a big advocate for partnerships. To be able to have corporate partnerships, to be able to work on projects and pieces of work together in a partnership capacity. And so because of that, I'm trying to bring people into the fold when I think value can be recognized from someone's services or product for another team, or trying to just find synergies and bringing people together so that 2 plus 2 can equal 5.
Yeah, and it was my normal question in our interview at this point would have been, tell me who your ideal client is. And I was sitting there thinking, well, is your ideal client those who you represent or those who you're making offers to? And kind of came back, it's both.
Yeah, yeah. Funny enough, it is both in a sense. Because I mean, I agree. Like, the reason I'm having conversations with government employees is because I feel like I have something to offer them that's of value to them. I am not just going to bug them. Like, government employees are very busy individuals, and they have a lot going on. And so, I mean, honestly, just like we all do, right? I think that white space on a calendar, that's endangered nowadays for all of us. I
Yeah.
know that. So it's tenfold for these government guys. And so if you want to, you come in and again showcase that you are listening to all of these articles and news releases and things that are coming out about the group. You have to do your due diligence, you have to come in pointed, and then you have to come in showing again that, like, what you're here to do is learn, be a sponge, and then also that based on what they provide to you, you might have something to offer them. So you are right. A lot of the people that I work with on the government side of things, I like to think that they appreciate me and know that, if I'm coming to the table, it's not just, just for nothing. It's because I have an idea or something I want to talk about with them. And so luckily, I think that that's good. To your point, about ideal clients, it's definitely folks that are trying to make waves in the federal marketplace. Some of them are completely net new, like we talked about, and I think that that's definitely something that is unique with us that we can bring to the table, is to help someone get in. But that said, I talk to a lot of groups that already do have a federal presence already. And that the market is, and that's one of the interesting things about the federal marketplace, is there's almost layers in a sense. There's like small business areas that you can play in. There's socioeconomic areas you can play
Yeah.
in. There's partnerships, again, is very big. And so, it's sometimes not even just, someone wanting to be net new in the federal marketplace, but someone who exists in the federal marketplace that wants to start, inching their way into another camp. They're looking for some partnerships, and they need some help finding the proper folks that they can partner with to get intimacy in agencies they want to start plugging into. They have an absolute foothold and are dominating in one agency, but they want to go over to another agency,
Yeah.
and they aren't
Yeah.
exactly sure how to have that resonate. And so we move over that way. It doesn't need to be someone who's net new coming into the federal marketplace, but it needs to be someone who wants to double down on their investment and their growth in the federal marketplace. That's one of my ideal clients.
Interesting. When somebody's coming in new, do you provide a get started service for them? I mean, do you get compensated for you're really a thought leader for them and how to organize structure, message, staff, all those kinds of things. Uh,
Mhm.
is that a compensatable relationship for you?
So I have a coaching package actually for some of the groups that are a bit smaller or that don't, quite have as much. I have a couple of employees now as well. We're fortunate that ACE has been growing. So for the groups that don't have quite as much, just open cash flow or discretionary funds to be able to have us support on an hourly, constant basis, I do work with them to do more of a coaching package, because again, I can kind of just talk about this with them. We can almost have a conversation similar to how you and I are having it today, and I can arm them with information for them to go out, get some things accomplished in an executable fashion before we sync again on the backside of it. So I do sort of have something in that realm, but if I'm being honest with you, when it comes down to just kind of like that onboarding in a sense in that package, I do that, just out of the goodness of the cause, I think, because this is the thing is I again, I know a lot of people, and so if I'm able to provide value by because I'm talking to this group and they realize they need new handouts and new collateral and I know someone who can provide that collateral, then I'm going to go ahead and connect them. And I think that that shows all around that again, I'm trying to provide value, and it builds goodwill with my colleagues too, because with my clients, I want them to
Sure.
understand that this is a long sales cycle too. And so I'm here for the long haul. So I'm not going to nickel and dime them to death on any little thing that needs to be accomplished. But I have a network that we can plug into for when we do realize that something we need to accomplish needs to be done ASAP, that we can plug into that. So, it's a lot of trying to facilitate connections with other vendors in the space, other contractors in the space. And again, just and honestly, going back to the same thing we were talking about, right? Building trust with my
Yeah.
client because to them, they want to see results. And again, of course, I want to deliver results, but as we've talked about, this is not a really straightforward environment. So the results
Yeah.
come, but with a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so, I want them to understand that, over time, I want us to have a good trust based relationship because for us to really see results, we're going to have to be working together for, a handful of months.
Yeah. 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 Um, Gonna switch direction here for a minute, because we're starting to run out of time. Um, Tell me about the future. Um, as a outsider or at least fringe person, it looks to me like there's more change going on in particularly your space, how we do business in Washington than maybe at any time in the last since there was a war. How do you see the future? What's different? If I want to do business in government space and I'm talking to you, what should I be thinking about in the future and uh, to be prepared?
I think it's the fact that if you know how to bring value to the table, but in a different capacity, that's sought after right now. I know that that's a very high level way to try to put it, but we have, to your point, done business in the federal marketplace in a very similar way for a very long time. There's a lot of things that are happening right now that are honestly exciting in the space. The federal acquisition regulations, the FAR, is actually undergoing a rewrite right now. Procurement channels are changing up. Things they call GWACs, government-wide acquisition contracts, are shaking up a little bit. Like we are in, while it's definitely a different time for us, it's very exciting the spot that we're in. And I think one of the trends that I've been seeing the most when it comes to events that I've been going to with people I've been talking to, both on the government side and the industry side, is honestly they're looking for disruptors right now. They're looking to put money into R&D. They're looking for things that are going to change. Again, we have been doing things in the government a certain way for a while, and so if there's ways that we can bring industry expertise to look at something and flip it on its head that they haven't seen before, honestly, that's really seen right now. Obviously we couldn't get through the podcast without bringing up AI or
Yeah, yeah,
ML and some of those
that's the next one.
buzzwords, but that's a big one right now too, and so I think it's trying to enable groups to do more with less, and bringing in this either new way of looking at it, new technology that can enable someone, that's really sought after right now. And so I would implore anyone who is thinking about getting into this space or is in this space and thinking about, how can I double down or how can I grow my business right now? It's, thinking outside the box and honestly coming to the table to talk to the government about like, hey, have you tried something like this before? Because I honestly think the best dialogues and the way that I've been able to get a deal, honestly, the stickiest is by going in and admitting to the groups that I don't know everything and that I'd like to discuss with them what I could learn more about and how I could flesh out my knowledge so that I can look at something in an all-encompassing manner. And then I might be able to come up with a more unique idea, or our team might be able to come up with a better solution than, if we had just come in right off the bat, assuming everything, right? Goes back to that. And so I think really to tie all this up into, a nice bow here is if you want to jump into the space, industry insights in, R&D, things that are on the cutting edge right now, they're really sought after in this space. And it's a good way for you to at least come in and start getting some conversations to say, I have something that I think could maybe help you, but I'd like to learn more about if that's true or not.
That's very cool because I think that's not how most people think about what's the opportunity in the government. Is that
I think it's yes and no. And again, I think the main thing I'll say to you is that for those who don't think about the opportunity that way, it's fair. because the one thing you have to think about is you almost have to explain to the group the problem with this
Oh
R&D
yeah.
type stuff and this early adopter type stuff. Sometimes you have to press your thumb down a little bit on the pain point to say, like, look, like
Oh,
this is
oh,
something that could happen, or
yeah.
something that we're seeing more in industry right now, because maybe we're a little bit ahead of where you guys are at in a certain subject matter,
Yeah.
certain thing. And this is something that we're already starting to account for in industry, like you all should be accounting for it. And so I think that that's sometimes why people don't think about coming into the government this place, is because they only go to the government to try to sell them what the government is looking for. But again, that goes back to building relationships, and the government is always looking for something that's going to improve its constituents' lives, improve its employees' lives, improve the ability to, again, execute upon the mission. And sometimes they just don't know what's out there, so they don't know what to ask for. So if you can go in and, again, explain the solution, explain the benefit, explain the problem, they might be just as willing to purchase it. It's just that they didn't have the knowledge to honestly even ask for it before.
So it sounds to me like ACE is um, a thought leader for people who have the ability to create an impact in the world, that ACE can help, just looking at your LinkedIn profile, bridge some gaps or create that new opportunity that didn't exist before because
Yeah.
you understand both sides of the equation.
I like to think I'm learning both sides of the equation. The government side of things, is very interesting. And every time I talk with someone about something, I learn something new. Again, I have a lot of different government folks that I consider friends, that, I've made friends with over time. And, when I talk with them, even about something that I believe I have a certain viewpoint on, even if it's the same topic, listening to them on the other side of the fence is very interesting. And it's interesting to hear about how we converse about the exact same item, but how I'm talking about it differently with them than if I would in the industry side. So I like to think I'm learning, what it is that the government looks for, what it is that, they need, how to, again, have these conversations and build relationships so that people trust me enough to say, I'm looking for something that can help me execute X. And then I can say, well, I know a couple of firms that might be able to support you. Let me get you connected. Or, vice versa on the industry side. But, it's definitely, again, there's a lot that goes into this space, and I would say more than anything else, you have to be open to learning when you're walking into the federal government, whether that be about the process, the marketplace that
Yeah.
you walked into, the process that you're selling, or, again, the really important one, which is the ultimate group that you're trying to sell into, or the ultimate client.
Well, Luke, this has been great, and um, I think your professional friend maker moniker is an excellent fit for you, and the your commitment, your purpose to tying all these things together, and you're creating value on both sides, the seller and the buyer, that probably in many cases they didn't even know was fully there. And so I think that's spectacular. So the last thing I want to ask you is, what advice do you have for entrepreneurs, or it could be acquirers, that they should be thinking about going forward in this world of AI and constant change?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. And, I think it's appropriate to end off on this. Right now, you need to just be thinking about knowledge in this space. Knowledge and information is something that's always powerful, but it's definitely getting shaken up a little bit with AI right now. So I think, AI enablement is something that I have seen quite a bit of right now in the federal marketplace. And so I think that's something that I would recommend people look out for right now. And I think that, again, kind of the reason I bring this up is because we're hearing a lot of AI and a lot of AI solutions, but the precursor to AI is, the data being correct, is the data being
Yeah.
transferred properly, is the infrastructure that goes around it. And so, that's definitely an interesting opportunity right now. I'd recommend a lot of different people look into that. But again, I think that more is the macro of what I want to get at, which is that, you have to think about in the government space how to flip things on its head over and over and over again. And so, you might be seeing something, you might see an opportunity be released for something that's sort of in rounds with you, but I think my main piece of advice with all of this is go be curious. Like, hey, I see that you guys want AI, but have you thought about AI enablement? What are you doing with the data? I see that you have an RFP out that's all about, an AI solution that can do X, Y, and Z. But have you thought about how clean your data is before that? Have you done this? And this is just one example I'm driving down again
Yeah,
because I think it's
yeah,
a top of mind one that's relevant. But, going and being curious. I think that that's just something you always need to do in this space because the more you can be curious and the more you can ask sometimes these flipped on their head questions like, well, have you ever even thought about this? They
yeah,
probably haven't. And if they start thinking about it, maybe there's an opportunity for you to, think about it with them. And so that's my
yeah.
biggest piece of advice for people, honestly, in any space, but especially in the government space, is don't be afraid to be curious about things. Especially, even if it's not necessarily in relation to what you do, but you can be curious and, kind of bring it into the area that you want to be in.
Yeah, thank you. And that's very, very compelling. And as you were saying it, it tied me back to something you said earlier. Um, One of my big takeaways from our day is, when you talked about the SOW going to an SOO of objectives,
Mhm.
or and then you went on and talked about outcomes. I could even see it being an SOO about outcomes.
Yep.
Um, and then what you just were talking about, the AI and the bringing things to the table, it sounds like the way you need to bring them is with an understanding of the types of outcomes you can create. And then part of what, as your bridge maker, you're matching those outcomes with issues that the government agencies are trying to find solutions for.
All the while educating them on things they might not be thinking about, right? They want to have this AI, they're very interested in it. Hey, that makes a lot of sense, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, but have you thought about, what you're going to do with the data that's going into the AI yet? You might not have. You might have, but have you considered all of these considerations? And so, you're being inquisitive, you're being curious, you're talking about the outcome, which is that, at the end of the day, they want an AI solution that's going to be able to increase productivity in this department by 10%. But you're again looking at that objective and really driving back into it. Now you're being curious and you're saying, hey, I know that you're looking at solutions right now, but are you thinking about the data on the back end? Are you thinking about the process flow for which this AI is going to plug into? Have you thought about training? It again goes
Yeah,
back to just the thought of, you can educate the government because sometimes they're just not sure what to think about. And sometimes it goes both ways, right? I mean, there's
yeah.
been times that the government's told me things that I had never known. And I was like, well, that's good to know. I didn't realize that that was something you guys completely covered in house. And so I think it goes back to that.
Well, Luke, this has been wonderful, and thank you for focusing on the government because that's a piece in whatever 4 years we've done this. We've never had that focus, so thank you. And the ACE model is really interesting in general, and so I think that's something that our audience is going to be interested in, whether it's government or for profit or not for profit, because I think you play in all of those. So I
Mhm.
want to thank you for that, and you know, who knows? Maybe we'll get you back again, and all your contact information's on the screen for everybody. So
Perfect.
I think Luke gave you a lot of reasons to want to reach out to him and to Ace, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one. In another 2 weeks, we'll have another one. And I want to thank Luke and thank all of you for being here today. Have a good one.
Thanks so much, Rick. Thanks, everyone.